In the previous section, we saw the climax of Jesus' confrontation with the Pharisees. You will have heard, you will, Lord willing, remember how in chapter 2, Jesus was in constant confrontation with the Pharisees. It began somewhat under wraps, under covers, when the Pharisees saw Jesus pronouncing a man's sins forgiven, and they grumbled in their hearts, saying, how can he say that? How can he forgive sins? Only God can forgive sins. And then from there on, the confrontation kept getting more intense, more out in the open, until in the previous 2 sections, the Pharisees confront Jesus openly and directly. At the end of the last section, chapter 3, verse 6, we see that the Pharisees go out and they begin to plot how they might destroy Jesus, how they might kill him, and take him off the scene, off the map entirely. Now this is the context in which our passage begins this evening. But something very interesting about where our passage fits in, Mark chapter 3, verse 7 to 12, is that this section could almost fit anywhere into Mark's Gospel. It is something that Mark actually likes to do. We call it a transitional recap. So he transitions into what lies ahead, and so he throws out some markers of what you should expect to come. But he also reminds us, he reminds us of what has gone before. And yet all the while, this section also brings its own point. It makes its own point. It has its own focus. And one of the things that we see in this is, again, the identity and the ministry of Jesus, and then the majesty of Jesus in terms of how people respond to him. So when we see who he is and what he does, then that requires that there be some response, even a response of trying to be cold toward this and saying, I don't care anything about that, or that is a response. Now, Mark tells us about the responses to Jesus. In fact, this is often a point that he makes. And he doesn't often say, what is your response? But he often leaves the question open. He shows us how people respond and then leaves it to the reader to say, okay, well, if that is the response of these different people, what is my response? And that is also a question that confronts us this evening. Now we begin in verse 7, and we see Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea. Now this is significant, the fact that Jesus withdrew, that he goes away. Now he doesn't just withdraw from that particular Sabbath day, the day on which he had healed the man with the withered hand, and from the Pharisees there. He actually withdraws in a more significant way. It marks his withdrawal from the established Jewish religion as a whole. How do we see this? Well, Jesus, up to now, you will have taken note, always goes to the synagogue. He's consistently teaching in the synagogue. Well, here and there he's teaching in other places as well. But generally we have seen Jesus in the synagogue on many occasions in just these 3 chapters, or two and a bit of chapters that we've covered so far. Now from this point onwards, Jesus only once more in Mark's Gospel returned to the synagogue, and that's in chapter 6. And even there it seems to be something of a courtesy to the people. He goes to Nazareth, his hometown, and when he arrives there, he goes to the synagogue to teach them from the synagogue, and immediately the people respond by rejecting him. Another response to Jesus. He is rejected by the people of his hometown. And then we read at the end of that section, in Mark chapter 6, verse 6, that Jesus went out and taught in the villages. And that is really the last thing that Jesus has to do with the synagogue. Jesus never in Mark's Gospel returns to teach in the synagogue. And so here, when Jesus withdraws in Capernaum, when his ministry in Capernaum, he withdraws from the synagogue and he withdraws from the Pharisees. It's signaling something more than simply that he didn't want the confrontation with the Pharisees to continue at this point. He's actually making the point. From now on, things will work differently. Now this we will see actually somewhat clearer when we come to the next section, the section when Jesus, after this withdrawal, takes his disciples he takes them aside and he appoints 12 to take the ministry further. And so Jesus says, we are done, we are finished with the established Jewish religion, which is an old wineskin that cannot be attached to what is new. It cannot take the new wine of what Jesus brings. It must be done away with. And so he brings what is new, and he establishes the church when he calls the disciples to and appoints them as apostles. Now, that's something that we will see in more detail next week. But so Jesus' withdrawal is now finishing with the Jewish religion, the religious establishment of the Jews. But we also see that Jesus takes his disciples with him. This is significant in terms of people responding to Jesus. And you can imagine that the disciples at this point following Jesus, but realizing that Jesus, in this confrontation with the Jewish leaders and the Pharisees, is signaling that things are changing. And for them to follow him is a significant commitment to him. And so that is really the first response that we see in this passage to Jesus, the response of the disciples who are willing to count the cost, to be willing to follow Jesus, even when that means that they will probably from then on be outcast from their own people. Now, Mark reminds us that the disciples whom Jesus had called are important at this point by telling us that Jesus went to the sea. Now, the sea was the scene previously where Jesus had called the disciples by name. We saw that in chapter 1, verse 16 to 20, where Jesus called Simon and Andrew and James and John. And then in chapter 2, verse 13 to 17, he called Levi, the one we know him as Matthew. And so Jesus calls these men, in each case, by the sea. That's the scene at which the callings take place. And so Mark reminds us of this. Then there's the next response, the following response that we read of in the rest of verse 7 all the way up to verse 10. This is the crowds that follow Jesus. Now, Mark distinguishes the disciples' following of Jesus by adding them into the phrase, Jesus withdrew with his disciples. In other words, the disciples withdrew with him. They went with him. The crowds don't withdraw with him. They have their own word. They have their own verb. The crowd go and follow by their own word. They follow him. And then, so they are a separate group, which is the next response. Now, this separate group come from everywhere. Now, we have to see something of the picture that Mark tries to draw for us in terms of how great this crowd is. So Jesus, you might expect, has now had this open confrontation with the Pharisees, and perhaps the people's interest in him had cooled down. Perhaps they were scared to attach themselves further, but they weren't. They still wanted what Jesus had to offer. And so the crowd that follows Jesus follows him from literally everywhere. That's really the point that Mark is making. He says that they came from Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea and from beyond the Jordan and from Tyre and around Tyre and Sidon. Now, if you look at a map, and I know many of your Bibles have maps in the back, and you can go after the service or whenever you like and go and look at those maps and go and look at these words and see where these places are. But if you have something of a picture in your mind of the world in which Jesus lived, he was now ministering in Capernaum. And Capernaum was next to the Sea of Galilee. So that district, that area was called Galilee. Capernaum, probably the largest city in that area. And that's fairly central, a little bit north, but fairly central. And on the one side, on the eastern side, if you look at the map, on the eastern side of Galilee, you had the Sea of Galilee, and from it flowed the River Jordan, and that ended up in the Dead Sea. And so you have this kind of line on the map. Now, when you then look at the places that Mark refers to, he's talking about places from every wind direction. Places from the north, places from the west, places from the south, and even crosses the Jordan, says places from across the Jordan. He's saying people are following Jesus from north, east, south, and west. From every direction, people are flocking to Jesus. They are flowing to him to see what he can do for them. And this crowd is an immense crowd. So immense, so great, so many were they, that they were really dangerous, especially because they were almost so eager to get to Jesus that they would trample one another to get to him. But Mark doesn't tell us that the crowd was in danger. He actually uses terminology that makes the crowd even more negative. They relate, in a sense, negatively to Jesus. So Mark tells us that these crowds, they follow Jesus. They come for healing. So Mark has been consistent in showing us that Jesus is willing to help the needy. But at this point, something changes. This crowd is not that crowd that Jesus is eager to help in their need. He actually wants to get away from them. You see, we read in verse 9, and he told the disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, lest they crush him, for he had healed many, so that all who had diseases pressed around him to touch him. In other words, the people come for healing. Now, we had seen previously that Jesus' primary intention was never the healing. Jesus' primary intention was to make known the gospel of the kingdom, to make known salvation has come to sinners. That has been Jesus' point. In chapter 1, we read that Jesus even said, when his disciples come and say, the crowds are looking for you, everyone is looking for you, and Jesus says, well, that is not why I came. Let me go to the other towns as well, that I may preach, for that is why I came, that I may make known the gospel of the kingdom. But the crowds still don't get that. The crowds miss this point. They still want something for the here and now. They still want health. Perhaps we could add wealth and prosperity again. And so these crowds come, but Mark describes them in very much negative terms. He tells us that this crowd was so pressing on Jesus that he needed a boat to get away from them. He needed to find a way to escape the crush. But the words that he uses to describe them is very specific. It says that the crowds, in verse 10, that they were pressing around him. Okay, now obviously the word crush is negative, and they could crush him. That literally that he would be oppressed by them. They were oppressive to him. That's the literal meaning of the word, that they could crush him, which I think translated by crush is actually very good, that we see the picture. Jesus is almost in danger for his life at this point. And then he uses another word, the word translated pressed around. They were pressing around. And this is a word that could more literally be translated that they were falling upon him. They were trying to fall upon him. Now that sounds like a strange way to put it, and it is, but that's why I'm saying that Mark was drawing this picture quite negatively. You see, to fall upon someone was actually a Hebrew idiom, a Hebrew expression for when someone would be given the command to attack someone. So, for example, when King David needed someone to go and exercise an attack on someone, he would use the phrase, go and fall upon them. That is, om aan te val, to attack. And that is what Mark is describing this crowd as. They were attacking Jesus to find what they wanted from him. Something that he, at least at this point, was not really eager to give them. In fact, so eager is he to escape this crush that he orders the disciples to give him, or to prepare a boat for him so that he may go onto the sea. Now, in one sense, and probably this is the primary sense, the point of the boat is simply for Jesus to escape the crush, in order for him to get away from this crowd. He flees the crowd. But perhaps there's also something of Mark preparing us for something that we will see in the near future in terms of the narrative as it unfolds. You see, in chapter 4, in the beginning of chapter 4, Jesus will actually use a boat to preach from. He uses it as a mobile pulpit. I'm sure you are all familiar. I'm not sure if it's only for me that passage has always struck to see Jesus on the close to the shoreline, standing in a boat and preaching to the masses standing on the beach. That's such a powerful image to think about how Jesus taught these people from a boat. And perhaps there's something of Mark also looking forward, remembering that day and that incident, and thinking, oh yes, I'm going to tell them about that as well. And so maybe he's also reminding us in a very subtle way that Jesus' intention was to preach, to make known the gospel of the kingdom, and not to heal in the first instance. And that we must always keep very clear in our minds, that the healing that Jesus gave to these people and that the apostles gave was always with the purpose of affirming the word, affirming who Jesus was, who he is, and what he came to do and what he came to say. Now that's very important for us to keep in our minds. And so we've seen now, up to this point in this passage, how the disciples follow Jesus, how they withdrew with him. That's the first response. And then there's the second response of the crowd. They want to see Jesus. They want to be with him, but only for their own purposes. They want to gain something for themselves rather than see what it is that he truly wants to give them. They come on their own terms rather than that they come on his terms. And so at this point we should really examine ourselves as well. You see, people today flock to Jesus as well with exactly this pattern. People flock to Jesus for the external benefits. That is why when you go out from our church and you drive around the area, and especially in the city, perhaps even more so, you will see thousands and thousands of cars standing at the parking grounds of those churches where health, wealth, and prosperity is offered to you if you simply follow Jesus. Or perhaps if you follow Jesus and pay a significant tithe to that church. Now, in one sense, it's too easy for us to point to those churches and then feel good about ourselves. Now, in one sense, we should do that. We should be very thankful to be part of that group of people that the Lord has called to himself, like the disciples, to be with him, to hear him speak, and to receive him on his terms. That is something to be truly thankful for, and not to think little of that. We must be thankful for that. And yet we cannot stop there and say, well, that makes us superior to other people and we are better than everyone else. We must still examine ourselves and think, but do we not perhaps also sometimes fall into the trap of seeking Jesus only for the external benefits? Just consider our prayers: health, wealth, and prosperity. Now again, we have to put the positive emphasis on that. It is right that we depend on the Lord for health and for wealth and for any kind of prosperity. In fact, without him, we wouldn't have any of that. And when we are in need of health, then it is from him that we must pray it for sure. And yet, we must always recognize that Jesus came in order to give us something greater than that. You see, it is such a temptation to think about health, wealth, and prosperity as being those concrete blessings that the Lord gives us, those things that are tangible. And then to think about the other blessings, the eternal blessings, as almost being lesser blessings because they are intangible. But that's not true. You see, God tells us in his word through the Apostle Paul that this life is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory. Those things that we look forward to in eternity are not less real than the things that we experience in this life. It is very much real. And we begin to experience those things now already. If we are truly saved by Christ, have been brought by faith into union with Christ and stand in a saving relationship with him, then we have something more concrete than physical health and wealth and prosperity. And so we should always look to Jesus for that which he came to give. The primary things that he came to give. The gospel of the kingdom, salvation from sin, a restored relationship with God and one another. Now, the passage does not end there. Mark adds still another response to Jesus. Perhaps this is the most striking response that we find in verse 11 and 12. And whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." Now, Mark doesn't mention at this point any exorcism. He doesn't tell us that Jesus cast out these demons. We saw that previously, actually in the synagogue, that Jesus cast out a demon. Now, Jesus obviously had the power to cast out demons. That's what we saw. Jesus rebuked the demon on that day, on that occasion, and in that passage, and it took no effort. The demon obeyed him. Even though he was unwilling, he still had no choice. He simply bowed before him. And that's what Mark tells us that the demons did everywhere. The demons fell down before him. The picture is actually of almost of worship. That they fall down before him, that they see him, they recognize his majesty, and they fall down before him and acknowledge who he is. Now, this falling before him always reminds me of in the Old Testament, we have that passage in 1 Samuel 5, when the Philistine God is brought in, when the Ark of the Covenant is brought into the temple of the Philistine God. His name is Dagon. And the Ark of the Covenant is brought before him. And the next morning when the Philistine priests go to see what's going on there, they find that the stone object that was their idol, Dagon, had fallen over. Even the stone fell before the presence of God and paid homage to him. Now, of course, the priests then are in such a state. What has happened? Dagon has fallen over. And so they put him back upright, and the next day they go in again, only to find that he has fallen over again with his head and his hands broken off. Even stone, even that not a god at all, but an idol, acknowledges God as God. And so these demons do the same. They fall before him. They acknowledge who he is. But consider exactly what they say about him. What do they confess about him? He is the Son of God. He is the Son of God. Now just think about the content of that confession. Well, that's a summary statement, of course. It's a summary phrase, the Son of God. Think about how we confess the meaning of that phrase. Jesus is, in our confession, the only begotten of the Father. He is before all worlds. He is light of light, very God, of one substance with the Father. And this is Mark's emphasis all throughout this gospel. Mark shows us the identity of Christ again and again. It is because he is who he is that he is able to do what he does. And that is why he must be responded to with worship and praise. Let's think about how Mark tells us this. He did this in chapter 1, verse 11, when at Jesus' baptism, the Father pronounced, "This is my beloved Son." He does so here in this passage that we read, chapter 3, verse 11, that the demons admit and confess that Jesus is the Son of God. We will see the same thing, that the demons confess who he is in chapter 5, verse 7. We will see again a heavenly voice in chapter 9, verse 7, revealing to the disciples that Jesus is his Son. And then the second last reference to Jesus as the Son of God is in chapter 14, verse 61 and 62, when Jesus is asked at his trial just before his death, "Are you the Son of the Most High, the Most Blessed?" And Jesus' response is, "I am." And then finally, the last reference to Jesus' Son being the Son of the Father, being the Son of God, is in chapter 15, verse 39. When Jesus had breathed out his last breath, the Roman centurion looks and says, "Surely this man was the Son of God." What a glorious confession. What a glorious confession to find on the lips of the demons. A confession that they make not because they want to acknowledge him, but because they can do no other. They cannot resist to express this truth. Now, of course, our aim should not be to confess Jesus as the Son of God in the same way that the demons do. The demons know who he is, but they shudder. They don't worship him in spirit and in truth. They don't look to him in faith, acknowledging who he is as the one who is able to save. But that is, of course, what Jesus proclaims to us all throughout the Gospel of Mark. What Mark makes known to us is that Jesus' intention is to make known the gospel of the kingdom, salvation for sinners. And so we are called to look to Jesus as the one who is the Son of God, who is able to save, and to confess him as that. To confess him as that with true faith. So we not only believe in our hearts, but we say with our mouths. That is our confession, what we believe expressed outwardly, that he is indeed able to save us from our sins. But then in verse 12, Jesus tells the demons to keep quiet again. He silences them. You see, the reason is that Jesus will only be known on his own terms. Just think about how he expresses this to John the Baptist when John the Baptist sends some of his followers to Jesus and to ask, are you the Messiah? Then in chapter 7 of Luke's Gospel, chapter 7, verse 22, Jesus responds to this question and says, Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised, the poor have good news preached to them. And Jesus says, tell John what you have seen and heard. And then he quotes from Isaiah. He focuses the attention on not only what is visible, what you have seen, but also what is audible, what you have heard. The testimony regarding Jesus. But then the testimony that he quotes is from the Old Testament, from Isaiah. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the good news preached to them. Now when we consider this passage of Mark's Gospel, Mark chapter 3, verse 7 to 12, Mark is reminding us of what we have seen before, and he is also preparing us for what is lying ahead. Mark consistently puts us before the identity and the ministry of Jesus, always with the implied question, what is his majesty, or what do you say about his majesty? How do you respond to him? How did the people respond? Well, they wanted the temporal blessings. How did the disciples respond? They clung to Jesus. They believed in him. They trusted in him. And so when we come to Jesus in faith, when we know him for who he is and acknowledge him for who he is, not like the demons did, but with true faith, with true trust in Christ, then we are saved. So come this evening, if you have not done so before, come to Christ. Put your faith in him, and you will be saved. Amen.